Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture, the first Levy lecture of 2021. This is, believe it or not, this is the beginning of our 5th lecture season. It's hard to believe, but we have a wonderful speaker that we'll be talking to, the author and New York Times reporter, Jennifer Steinhauer, author of The First, which is a wonderful book. But let me get into our housekeeping announcement. We'll begin. My name is Wendy Cromash. I am delighted to be hosting today's Levy lecture. I want to thank the Levy Senior Center Foundation for generously hosting the lecture series. We could not do it without them. We also want to thank Abigail Evanston, who was one of our corporate sponsors. Abigail Evanston is less than a year old. It's now open on Oak Street, just north of Church in downtown Evanston. If you're looking for maintenance-free living packed with upscale amenities for active adults 25 or 55 plus, make sure you stop in for a visit. It's a great option for people who want to downsize without the commitment of buying. Rentals start at only $18.85 per month. It caters to people that crave an active and vibrant lifestyle in beautiful surroundings. Amenities include regularly scheduled cocktail parties and happy hours, a concierge on site 7 days a week, outdoor entertaining, beautiful views of the lake in downtown Evanston, fitness and wellness programs all year round. Of course, Abigail Evanston serves pandemic protocols, making it easy and you to tour the building. Make an appointment today and take advantage of special opening pricing and flexible lease timing. The staff at Abigail Evanston makes it so easy to move in. You will fall in love with your new home and the hospitality it provides. Learn more at abigailevanston.com or call 847-802-8700. Okay, without any further ado, let me tell you about our speaker today. Jennifer Steinhauer has covered numerous high-profile beats in her 25-plus years of reporting at the New York Times, from City Hall bureau chief and Los Angeles bureau chief to Capitol Hill. She won the Newswoman's Club of New York Front Page Deadline Reporting Award in 2006 for her reporting on Hurricane Katrina. The First is her first book, but she has also written a novel about the television business, as well as 2 cookbooks, so 4 altogether. Jennifer, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. I'm going to get right into some of the questions, and I know we've already started to get some questions, so we have a lot to unpack. First thing I wanted to do is talk about Nancy Pelosi, who is the master strategist. I'm going to read just a little bit from your book about some of her political skills, and then I think our listeners would appreciate hearing your insights about her and your insights about her. Pelosi's ability to manage her fellow Democrats has had few modern rivals. Although dismissed by many on the left as too cautious and overly wedded to the institutional traditions of Washington, it was Pelosi who almost single-handedly maneuvered among them to bring the Affordable Care Act to life in 2010, rather than the small ball bill to increase health care for children that Rahm Emanuel, Obama's skittish White House chief of staff and former Chicago mayor, had wanted. Pelosi also delivered George W. Bush his Wall Street bailout in 2008, showing not only her ideological dexterity, but her iron-fisted control of the speaker's gavel. Her dexterity, and you add in parentheses, it should be noted that this is a woman who occasionally eats her beloved Dove ice cream bars with a knife and fork, is matched only by her remarkable skills of self-preservation, even after years of calls from some corners of her own party that she'd go away. We could go on about her, but she is definitely, seems to me to be the most powerful woman in Washington.
Well, I'll respond to that. First, I just want to thank the Levy Senior Center for hosting me on this gray Tuesday afternoon. At least it's gray here in Washington. I assume it's gray there too. And I appreciate the wonderful showing. I can see that there are literally hundreds of you here. Just super exciting. It's been a while since I've done an event with so many people, and it's great to be able to reach so many folks and readers. We all appreciate everyone who's reading in this time. It's been a difficult year for books, as you might imagine. And so it's always exciting to hear people, to see people interested in books, reading authors, author talks, etc. So it's very personally gratifying for me to be here and to see all of you here. And I'm tremendously grateful to the Levy Senior Center and its sponsors for having me. Now, as it pertains to Nancy Pelosi, her status as the most powerful woman in Washington will ostensibly shift at the end of this month when Kamala Harris becomes vice president. And in many people's views at this point, the heir apparent to running for the big job when Joe Biden decides to leave or leaves on his own accord, whenever that may be, or is voted out, in which she would be the nominee. So having said that, Nancy Pelosi still probably will be the most important woman in Washington in terms of Joe Biden's legislative agenda as president and congressional control of that agenda, whether it be a divided Congress as we have now, or with full Democratic control, which, as we all sit here and speak between Illinois and DC, we know the people of Georgia are lining up to vote or have already cast their votes, and today's the big day there for the Senate runoff that determines control of the Senate. Hugely important. And I would add the culmination of a lot of political themes that led to the moment that we're in, the election of all these women in 2018 that I wrote about, and the 2020 election itself. So Nancy Pelosi's role is, as you point out, to push Democrats in the direction that she needs them to do, which is going to be extremely difficult this time around because her majority has shrunk so much between election losses, seats that were lost, and because you have a handful of people who won re-election but then were poached by the Biden administration for cabinet level and other types of positions. So with a very narrow majority, she nonetheless easily got her speaker's gavel back, which is a demonstration of her longevity, even though it's widely believed this is her last term as speaker. She's still going out in her 80s with this iron-fisted over the gavel and over that caucus. And so many people who said, we're not going to vote for you for speaker, went ahead and did it anyway. Sometimes they did it 2 Congresses in a row and they did it. So it shows you that that Democrats, even when they grouse about her, don't necessarily think they have too many options to her.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was fascinating to read how she met with each of the new Congress people who were elected, and she understood exactly what they needed in order to have a stronger appearance at home, and she was able to make deals, to get them over to her side. It's just, I found it fascinating. Maybe it's very evident if you've been in Washington a long time and are used to that kind of thing, but I found it fascinating that she could just be sort of wheeling and dealing. That was that was one of her main functions. Yeah, jump in.
That is kind of old school Washington, although I will say her predecessor, John Boehner, who's not her immediate predecessor, that was Paul Ryan, but he was not very skilled at that. He kind of had his group of people and kept them close to him, and that did not serve him in the end. He ended up basically being done in by the people he had helped to elect. But not to your point, not every member of Congress wants the same thing. Some people want things that are going to benefit their district. Some people want things that are going to benefit their personal office. And sometimes you'd be surprised at the remarkable small bore and petty things that people want in exchange for their vote on things like, a bigger television budget or an extra staff member and things like that, literally. But sometimes people want to make sure that a pet bill of theirs gets a hearing, that they get to certain spots on committees. So different people have different needs. And to be a leader of such an unwieldy and diverse group, you really need to meet people where they're at and know what those needs are and to try and make those promises to them.
Yeah, I think she's remarkable. Okay, Lauren Underwood is a representative who is from Illinois. She is a nurse. She is extremely talented. She won a very close reelection this past a few months ago. In fact, her challenger actually declared that he was the winner.
Oh, I watched it all in real time. I saw him do that. Yeah.
Yeah, prematurely. And she was so steadfast and calm. And she said, a lot of the votes have not been counted yet. We remain confident that we will prevail. And she did. And she comes out in your book. One gets the impression that she is very smart, very strategic. She's not drawn into some of the clickiness, and it just more impressive than I had already thought about her.
Well, I'm glad you bring up Lauren Underwood. I bring her up a lot when I talk about my book, and most people around the country who are not from the state of Illinois have never heard of her. That's in part due to some of the things that you're bringing up, and in part because, she's a more low-key member in a lot of ways. But I think that in a lot of ways, Congresswoman Underwood is very representative of that class, the 28 those who won their election 2018. First of all, like many people, she is a first. And she's not just a first in one way. She was a first in multiple ways. She was the youngest person to win her seat in Naperville. She was the first woman to win that seat. And she was the first person of color to win that seat. So she was checking a lot of boxes. A lot of people were the first woman or the first, Arab, Muslim woman. She had a lot of firsts going for her. She was not the party's pick. She was in a very crowded primary. I think there were 7 or 8 people, all the rest of them men. The party apparatus was not particularly interested in her. She wasn't a well-known person. She beat them all. And then she went on to do the next difficult thing, which was to beat a Republican incumbent. So those are two big things that she had to accomplish as a relative unknown who had a kind of a minor role in the Obama administration as with her healthcare background. And she understood as she was campaigning and when she got to Washington that just talking about Donald Trump and railing against Donald Trump was not a winning message for her in her Republican majority district, in which she grew up, by the way, and knew a lot of people very well. Or was that going to necessarily get her what she needed to do in Washington? So she certainly was not affiliated with the so-called squad, which I'm sure we'll get into. But nor was she necessarily part of any particular group, except that I would say she was very interested in healthcare and healthcare legislation and healthcare issues. Those are issues she campaigned on. Those are issues she won on. Those are issues she chose to legislate on and get bills passed. And kind of returned to those themes in 2020, which of course the pandemic, created a whole different framework for. But Lauren Underwood is very much the type of woman and the type of member, the type of Democrat who won in 2018 and was able to be successful, even in a very difficult environment in 2020, where Trump was at the top of the ticket and drawing out more Republican voters who might have otherwise been inclined to cast the ballot against her.
Yeah, and she, there's this, when you introduce her in the book, you talk about how after her first election, she was exhausted and thought that she would have some time off, but everything started right up again where she had to find housing. She had all kinds, she had to hire staff. There was this whole set of other things that she needed to do. And then when when the governing work actually begins, I think it was Lauren who mentioned that in all their briefing, healthcare wasn't mentioned at all. And they, she was just very surprised by the level of dysfunction that was ingrained with Congress as it exists.
Yeah, and that was pretty endemic of a lot of people who got elected that year. And not only were they surprised by it, because many of them were kind of new to politics and frankly, maybe a little naive about Washington, but they were also particularly unnerved by it because they felt like people like Lauren Underwood had won in non-traditional campaigns and in non-traditional ways in terms of how they raised money, how they grew support. She talked a lot about going to Republican areas in her state where Democrats hadn't even bothered to show up for years. So she won in a very different way. And I think she, like others, got to Washington thinking they were going to govern in a little different way. And it was kind of a smack in the face to realize that it's a town that still is an institution that is still very much dominated by seniority and traditions.
Yes. And rampant sexism, apparently. That was another theme that comes through. One of the early quotes in the book is, on the one hand, this is on page 4. On the one hand, some of the more liberal men were careful to wax on about how thrilled they were to have these exciting new women in Congress, but after several months, even they let it be known to House leadership that they were sick of hearing about them. They wanted the men wanted us to know that they were still in charge. And that's just the beginning of several, appalling incidents where men get away with behavior that women aren't allowed.
It's true. The main issue that women have in Congress is there aren't enough of them. We had this historic year for women, and still they're not even a full 25% of Congress, which is kind of remarkable. What's interesting about all of this is, if you go back to Jeanette Rankin, who was the first member of the House, won in 1917, she was certainly an object of curiosity, but she didn't really, I think people were careful with her. It's really interesting. You see these photographs of all these men, this one woman in her day hat, sitting in the House. And certainly there was interest in her as a woman. What was she going to wear? And the newspapers printed her lemon pie recipe. But there was some sense of deference to her in a way, not that she got on any good committees or anything like that. That didn't happen for women for years. And then what you had after that period, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, when you just had a handful of women at any given time, 1, 2, maybe 4, most of them in those early years were largely women who took the seats of their dead husbands or a relative. And they often usually came from very wealthy families, and there are families that sort of supported them. And they were always seen as adjuncts and continuations of their family. It was only when women really started to run on their own accord, who recruited, usually deciding on their own in the 1970s, especially when you had this big acceleration of women in both parties, particularly Democrats, where men started to really get unnerved as their numbers grew and as their agency and their sense of themselves as belonging there, rather than inheriting a seat and carrying out Mr. John Smith's agenda, to having their own agenda, very much tied to, the ERA, women's rights movement, the movement against the Vietnam War, and all kinds of other, at that time, very progressive movements that a lot of the women, the Democratic women, I should say, although, as you will watch, I don't know if anyone's ever seen the show, the series Mrs. America, which chronicles the ERA attempt, and it really kind of centers around the story of Phyllis Schlafly and her successful attempt to topple it. What's really striking to people, I think, when you watch that, is how much Democratic and Republican women stuck together around that issue in the 70s. And there was much less divisiveness between women in that time. Even though they were Republican and Democratic women and they were loyal to their parties to an extent, they had to work together to have any power because none of them had any power in the institution. They were not good committees. They had to promulgate their agenda often through their women's caucus. That changed a lot after the Gingrich Revolution and in the 80s. And the Republican women who started to come were much more conservative as well, and certainly not as interested in those issues after the spectacular final defeat of the ERA, which had looked, pretty much like it was going to be ratified at one point. So the types of abject sexism and harassment and worse was really rampant then and chronicled in my book. And that, of course, has continued through the years. Kirsten Gillibrand has written about being harassed by male senators, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York. I think the guys have to be more careful now in the Me Too era, and they've even actually codified in Congress legislation about dating and things like that within your office. Of course, interestingly, the first person to fall after that legislation was passed was none other than a female. And one of the females who won in 2018, Miss Katie Hill from California, who quickly rose to become a leader of the freshman class and was this real pet of Nancy Pelosi's, and is a little bit of a more moderate Democrat who was really looked like she was a rising star, and got into hot water over a sex scandal, particularly that ran afoul of those new rules. So that was an interesting twist on that. But again, I would say the biggest problem that women have again in Congress is just not having enough of them.
True. Are there issues that the Republican and Democratic women work together on? Is there any of that?
Well, I would say that by and large, partisanship does usually trump gender in Congress and in most legislative bodies. There are certain kinds of things they work on together, some things that benefit children and families, and an autism legislation I can remember women spearheading. But I would kind of point again to the fact, I'm going to go back and say it again, because I think it's really important, that you kind of have to have critical mass to test that theory. And I would say we see it a little bit in the Congress with them, for example, pushing the 12 weeks of parental leave for federal civilian employees. Women have been talking about that for a long time. And I think it took having a few more women in Congress to make that happen. But I think that in Nevada, for example, where it's the only state legislature in the country that has majority women. It's just barely, but they do. And that's where you can say, oh, does it matter to have, a large number of women in a legislative body? In that case, you can look at bipartisan things that occurred, such as requiring rape kits in police centers, and a lot of things around issues like that, that there was sort of a no-brainer for women. And it's not that men oppose those necessarily, but they were never going to be the ones to introduce and champion that. And so once when you start to see things that are truly bipartisan, it tends to be, not exclusively, it tends to be legislation that is geared toward women, families, and children, and it tends to be championed in large numbers.
Interesting. Okay. Katie Hill, who is another rising star you talk about, very smart woman. She talks about how people are operating from fear, that they're not always able to support some of the things that they may believe in because they have to worry about being reelected and how that's going to play at home. Can you talk about her?
Yeah, I mean, Katie Hill or Katie Porter? Would you be talking about Katie Porter, who's still, because Katie Hill got thrown out. We were just talking about her. And then there's Katie Porter, who's from Southern California, and she kind of made a star of herself in her in the oversight hearings.
I think, yes, I misspoke.
Yes, and she is from Orange County, California. And people were always confusing them because it was the two Katies from California, from Southern California even. And she was a disciple of Elizabeth Warren, a law professor, ran against another woman, Republican, defeated her in 2018, won her election, even though a lot of Democrats really got kicked out in 2020 in California. She held on to her seat. again, built her reputation being really tough in these oversight committees. She kind of became known as Katie Porter with the whiteboard, because she would bring these whiteboards and start questioning witnesses. And I think that what a theme that a lot of the, and it may have been Katie Hill who said that, however, because I think what a lot of people were feeling when they first got there was that they wanted to stand up for things and perhaps champion things that they understood may not be so popular in districts that were, majority Republican or pretty 50-50. And so they were not necessarily going to be as supportive of some components of a progressive agenda. Sometimes they didn't support anyway, but sometimes that they did. The pressure to get reelected starts literally the day you're sworn in. You're already pressured to start raising money for your next race. The kinds of votes that you take immediately, people start to worry are going to be used against them. That's the problem with having 2-year terms, is that you're perpetually in cycle.
Yeah. That became very clear reading. Okay, let's talk about AOC. You describe her, here are some of the things that are mentioned. Not a legislative force. Her staff is alienated all but a handful of other offices. But she is also self-aware and prematurely self-depreciating. She's also extremely photogenic and very well-spoken, extremely media savvy, social media savvy, and she has a lot of, she just has a lot of assets and has risen to very visible positions. Can you talk about that?
Well, when I talk about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who of course became the most famous person to win in 2018 by a mile, in part because she was not really obviously known. She was a young woman who at the time had been working as a bartender. Her experience in politics was largely being a volunteer on the Bernie Sanders campaign, and some work she did at Standing Rock, and more like as a protester, so not in any legislative experience, not in any formal political role. And so it was her very surprising defeat, not only that she won it all, but that she beat a very powerful long-term incumbent in Joe Crowley, who was often spoken about as a possible next speaker after Nancy Pelosi. So it was who she beat, it was how she beat him. And you're absolutely right. Not only is she very savvy on social media, but AOC is just generally speaking an excellent communicator. She reaches people through different medium, through gaming and other types of social media to reach young voters, but she's also very well-spoken and willing to touch things that other people are not, in a very candid way when she's giving interviews and presenting herself in other forms. For example, I think one thing that really stood out and got her bipartisan praise, which is very rare for her, was when she was cursed at and called nasty names by a Republican colleague on the steps of the Capitol, which was overheard by a reporter. And so that was how it became known. And she addressed it quite openly on the floor of Congress, on the floor of the House. She spoke about it, and she talked about how she was not concerned about his words because she'd been hearing them her whole life, as all women who work in the service profession or, ride the subway or, go to school, have these interactions with men at some point in their life, and how she was more concerned with how it was viewed by younger women and the message that was being sent by it. So that was a very powerful speech. It was very well watched for a speech on the House floor, which is not usually something that gets into the popular culture, and got a lot of attention. So that's the kind of thing that she's able to really do, to speak in plain language and very relatable, especially to young people, talking about and sort of demystifying too the process of Congress, taking her iPhone camera around and showing people the halls of Congress and showing kind of how things are done. Letting people, see in the side of the kitchen, if you will. So that's been part of her popularity. I would say look, the important thing I like to talk about with her, though, is that there's a huge difference between having political power and prowess and legislative power and prowess. They're very, very different things. On one hand, you could say that AOC is one of the most powerful Democrats nationally. You could say, with Bernie exiting the stage for the last time, that she is the titular head of the progressive wing of the party, and that she drives a political agenda in some ways, and maybe even the future of the party. But when you talk about Congress, she's out of the mainstream of congressional Democrats. And I'm going to extend that even to, obviously, President-elect Biden, who obviously, as everybody knows, came out as a moderate alternative in a crowded Democratic field, and obviously ultimately prevailed across generations, but the base of the party, which remains still much more moderate than the more vocal and high-profile progressive left, as exemplified by AOC. So when she got to Congress, she was immediately pretty unpopular because she was threatening some of her colleagues with primaries. She was getting a lot of attention. And so because it's an institution that's built on relationships, a lot of times people weren't really interested in working with her and supporting her legislation and doing things with her. And so she hasn't had a very successful legislative career. And she was denied a seat on Energy and Commerce, which is a very powerful committee. It usually takes years and years to get on that. No exceptions were obviously made for her, even though she has all this political power. The New Green Deal, obviously, I think barely got a hearing. So she doesn't really have a lot of influence over other members or over the legislative process or over House Democrats writ large. What she does have a lot of influence is within the party apparatus and within the sort of the party messaging. And that goes both ways, because Republicans have seized on her. They used to always kind of use Nancy Pelosi as their, oh no, Nancy Pelosi, if you elect Democrats, Nancy Pelosi. Now they often use AOC as the visage, if you will, of Democratic excess, socialism, and so forth, and some of the other members of the so-called squad. But her particular, I was in Paris last February visiting my daughter abroad, and I was surprised to walk down the street and see a poster of AOC I think it was for in connection with a progressive French radio station. But that just shows you how broad her reach is in leftist politics.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think it was Laura Underwood who said, though, that a lot of us, I'm paraphrasing, but a lot of us received more votes than AOC, and we're not afraid of her power, that it's still only one vote, and she's a great communicator, but she's alienated people that she needs to work with, if not her directly, her staff. And so do you think she has learned from some of the setbacks? Does she even consider them setbacks?
Well, to contextualize what Congressman Underwood said back then, and it was pretty early into the term, I think she's addressing two things. One is, we don't think that she can really have any power in a Democratic primary, because in most of our districts, the most far left person does not win the primary. In most, the Justice Democrats, which is kind of the most emergent progressive left, if you will, which produced AOC, had no other primary victories that year. They kind of later claimed Ayanna Pressley and Ilhan Omar because they supported them, but they were not really involved in their primaries. AOC was a homegrown Justice Democrat candidate. Two more have joined them this year in the new 117th Congress, but only two. And that most of the Democrats in the primaries are not affiliated with the Justice Democrats movement. And so she's saying she's probably not a threat to me in my primary. And she certainly isn't going to have any impact in a race in a district that's majority or largely Republican. It's quite the opposite. She can drag you down. And in fact, as you all may have heard, after the 2020 election, many moderate Democrats felt that they did lose their election. They didn't blame her, but they talked about the message that's coming from the progressive end of the party, particularly, for example, the defund the police message, which even though some of them spoke out against quite vocally, they still got kind of tarred with that. And Abigail Spanberger, who we can talk about because she's a part of a group of women who call themselves the badasses. Those are another squad, if you will, of women who come from national security space. A lot of them are military veterans. She quite famously, it leaked out, right, as she was saying it literally, she said right after the day after the election, I don't ever want to hear that word socialism again. I almost lost my race because of that, which she almost did. Lauren Underwood also, as you pointed out, came very close. A lot of these races were really close. So AOC sort of as a symbol and the agenda that she's associated with can often be a drag on Democrats, but she's not really a threat to them in a Democratic primary in too many places. Some places for sure, and we saw that in 2020. Again, two people, one of whom had lost in 2018, did prevail. Two, in fact, now that I think about it. So three total. So they won this time around. So it's not as if she has if that wing of the party has no power. The progressive left may well be the future of the Democratic Party. And don't forget, there are some progressive agenda items that actually connect up with some of the philosophies and agenda of Trump followers. You will note, of course, that President Trump in his waning days was pushing for a $2,000 check to go to all individuals, pandemic relief. That was aligned with House Democrats. That was part of their agenda too. So there are aspects of populism and progressivism, if you will, that actually align. So it can be a strange coalition, but largely, of course, Republicans, particularly Trump-related Republicans, are against the likes of AOC and so forth, and so they will paint other Democrats as being connected to her as an effort to defeat them.
Okay, but has AOC adjusted her style in
right. I didn't answer that part of your question. Yeah, I would say she has actually. She a lot of the staff that you mentioned that I talk about, the wars that her staff kind of started, these battles they picked with other members, most of them are gone now. She got rid of them, I believe, at the advice of the speaker. She never really admitted to that, but I think that's what happened. Even though she and Pelosi don't exactly have like warm, fuzzy relationship, she respects her, and I think she told her, and others told her, you got to get rid of those guys. They're dragging you down. And she stopped making open primary threats. And I think that she also, at the speech I mentioned before on the floor, she earned her respect. She's also very good at oversight committee. She's really good at questioning people. I will say she has good staff work in that regard, and she does her homework, and she really knows how to question witnesses. A lot of times, when you go to a congressional hearing, members kind of use their time to pontificate and show off for the cameras and state their opinions about what's going on. And she doesn't use her time that way. She really drills into witnesses. So she certainly has earned the respect of some of her colleagues in certain areas. But I think that between her political agenda, which often doesn't align and can harm them, or they don't plain agree with, and certain professional resentments / jealousies, I still say she's fairly unpopular within the Democratic caucus, particularly now that it's become so much more narrow and endangered.
Interesting. But you also talk about how even the Republicans may not work with her legislatively, yet they were all interested to introduce their kids to her when they were being sworn in.
Yeah, she's a celebrity, and it always makes me laugh because, and I haven't been up there in a couple months, and since I certainly haven't been up there since the pandemic, and I don't know what the interactions are like, but I used to very often watch Republicans watch her or kind of try to talk to her in the elevator because it was funny. I mean, although they're all well known in their districts, and some few of them are national figures themselves. There was a fascination with her, this young woman, the youngest female to ever serve, the youngest person to ever serve in the House, and her, again, this dynamic, forceful personality who had toppled a king in the Democratic Party. I think she was definitely an object of fascination, and many of their kids knew who she was and were interested in her.
Okay. You mentioned the badasses. Can you talk about them, please?
Yeah, so I like to often say, and I believe it to be true, that in a lot of ways, I find the badasses to be more of a squad than the actual squad. Why do I say that? First of all, the squad, which if we'll just remind everybody who that is, AOC, who we've spent a lot of time talking about, Ayanna Pressley from Boston. She was a city council member who broke a lot of glass ceilings there before she came to Congress. Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar from Michigan and Minnesota, respectively, who together became the first Muslim women in Congress. Very different backgrounds, however. Rashida Tlaib comes from a Palestinian background. Her grandparents are there still. That's very much her orientation, from the Detroit area, even though her district is not majority Arab like some districts in that Detroit area. She's actually from a majority Black district, which made her victory in 2018 and 2020, the primaries, pretty interesting. Ilhan Omar, rather, as everyone knows by now, I think, Somali refugee, came to Minnesota, as many refugees from that area did, in the 80s, and lived in that community, and kind of came up through that system and served for a very short period in the Minnesota legislature. Rashida Tlaib was in the Michigan legislature, I should say, too. Longtime community activist, but also had served several years. So they had a little bit of legislative experience between them, particularly Rashida Tlaib. So they had different backgrounds, and they didn't really know each other until they got to the Hill. And in terms of their political agenda, while they're largely aligned, they often vote differently. They're not like the House Freedom Caucus that we saw with the Republicans, who they often get compared to. Those guys always voted as a bloc. They voted together to vote. They were very organized in that way. They were really their own little subset, where these women kind of go their own way. While all of them except for Ayanna Pressley supported Bernie Sanders, she was a supporter of Elizabeth Warren from her home state of Massachusetts. So they're not just completely unified and monoliths. So sorry for dog barking. That's just part of the home thing. However, the women who had the national security backgrounds, the military veterans, Chrissy Houlihan of Pennsylvania, Abigail Spanberger, who I'd mentioned, from Virginia, also from Virginia, a former woman from the Navy, Elaine Luria, who's been in the Navy for 20 years, Mikey Sherrill, this incredibly dynamic mom of four, who would also is a military veteran who'd gone to the military academy, elite military academy. She's from New Jersey. All of whom won, by the way, most of them pretty easily this time around. They were a squad along with some of the male veterans, because they were supported by a group called Vote Vets, which works to elect progressive, not just progressive, I shouldn't say it works to elect Democrats who have served in the military into elected office, particularly Congress. And so they were organized by them, and they kind of ran together. They would do events together a lot as women. They knew each other when they showed up. They had a group text. They voted pretty much uniformly. They came together to decide ultimately something. And I should have mentioned Alyssa Slotkin, too, from Michigan. I knew I was missing someone. She had been in the DOD. She'd been in the CIA. So had Abigail Spanberger, served under Republicans and Democrats, moderate member from the Lansing area of Michigan. Tough campaign. I think she told me once her neighbors on each side had Trump signs in their yard, but they probably voted for her. A lot of ticket splitting with Alyssa Slotkin. Tough woman. I was always a little afraid of her. But they were really, they really work as a unit, and they had decided, even though it was not an issue they wanted to get ensnared in at all, it was not popular in their districts, they didn't want anything to do with it. They ultimately came together as a group, decided to write a letter endorsing the notion of bringing impeachment proceedings against the president. Wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about it, which was highly influential on the rest of the Democrats to go ahead and move forward that process. And there are different minds of how that all worked out, and whether that ended up being an asset or a mark against everybody in the campaigns. But be that as it may, they did that as a squad.
So what is their collective point of view about what is taking place now with what President Trump is doing, trying to overturn the Georgia election?
I haven't spoken to any of them, but it's not, I would not be going out on a limb to say that I'm sure that they're appalled by it. They're not fans of the president. It's just that they have never made being against President Trump central to their agenda, because that's not a winning message in their districts. They focus on issues that are very locally important. Again, a lot of it centered around healthcare, drug costs, healthcare costs. Everybody knows those are still key issues for Americans. It will continue to be so, certainly during this pandemic, especially, my gosh, as these hospital bills start rolling in, everybody can identify with these issues. Those are the ones they try to keep central to their campaign. But at the same time, as I alluded to earlier, with the meetings that's gone on with Democrats in the post-election environment, they're concerned with the party moving too far to the left and alienating their voters, and alienating what they consider to be the moderate axis of the party, if you will. And that tension started in the 116th Congress when they were sworn in, including in the starting with the speaker vote that year in 2019 and moving into that entire congressional period, and we see it playing out now. Now, right now, what's going on in Congress this week is this whole highly unusual process in which you have a group of Republican senators and Democrat and House members too. You have Republicans in Congress stating that they will object to protest the certification of Joe Biden's election. And so that is the central defining theme of how this Congress is starting out. That obviously unifies Democrats against Republicans uniformly. And of course, some Republicans have joined Democrats in saying they're not going to do that. They're of course going to certify the president-elect. But that's the animating force right now. That's highly partisan, incredibly divisive, and there's no plurality of thought, if you will, with the Democratic Party about that issue. Once Joe Biden is inaugurated, and once Congress gets down to the business of first, obviously, the confirmation process of his cabinet, and then gets into his legislative agenda, which I imagine will move very quickly because, again, a lot of it's going to have to address the COVID stuff. That's when you're going to start to see, again, divisions within the party, I think.
So the election today in Georgia is extremely important.
Oh, clearly, that determines the fate of everything on some level.
You talk about, I'd like to talk about your process, just all the work you did, researching, speaking to these people, following them through meetings, going to their home districts. You were really the fly on the wall for so many people. And you talk about your process where you say that you're both a witness and a stalker. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate? Because I just can't imagine how many countless of hours you spent talking to them.
Well, I had two advantages that worked together. When I was asked by my editor, Betsy Gleek at Algonquin, to write this book, because she was very interested in this class of women, I had two advantages going for me. One was that I had covered Congress for many years, and I knew how Congress worked. I knew how to find people. I knew how the hearing processes worked, where they were going to be, how the voting processes worked, where you could find members when they're going to vote. I was not a stranger to Congress, so that gave me a huge advantage. And connected to that is the fact that the members of Congress are very accessible because they are doing these things I just mentioned. You can get a schedule and you can find out every day what all the hearings are for the day, and you know what members are on what committees. Now, they often have simultaneous hearings and they're running here to there, but you can find them. When they go to vote is when all the reporters descend on the various hallways and byways to find members. They even know, we kind of memorize what doors they like to use, the various entry points to the chamber and so forth. We know where their House office buildings are, so where they're likely to be coming from, to stalk them, if you will, and ask them questions. That's one of the joys of covering Congress. That's why you see a lot of reporters in Washington who are assigned to Congress. They never leave. They like that beat because the people they cover are right there, right in front of them, accessible, and they can ask them questions on behalf of the voters in real time every single day. It's hard to avoid the press for very long if you're a member of Congress. So that was the great thing. And having, been experienced on the Hill, I knew where to find them, how to find them. And I spent also a lot of time, obviously, in more formal one-on-one interviews in their offices. I did, as you point out, visit them at home. Um, Usually as a welcome guest, not always, but again, a lot of the members' schedules are public at home too. They're going to this event and that event. And so you can kind of follow along, fly on the wall style to a lot of that. And especially when you're welcome to even more of it, because you're listening to meetings and so forth. I spent like 12 hours with Katie Porter one day in Orange County, going from one thing to the next, and really got to see a sense of her style. And it's very important to be home with members, whether you're a newspaper reporter covering Congress or writing a book, because members are very different often back home than they are in Washington, and how they interact with voters. So that's just, what I did. I would be doing my day job as a newspaper reporter, but I would be going to hearings and chasing them around and having meetings with them, and trying early on, from the day they came for freshman orientation before they were seated in November of 2018. Also, some people like AOC, who's still even now dominating conversations, were obvious, but trying to identify people who would be interesting characters and have interesting narratives and interesting stories to tell, and might become important players in their caucus, in Congress, in Washington. We see that playing out now. I look at Deb Haaland, who's one of the two Native American women who got less attention than most of the firsts, I would argue, even though their impact on that community was tremendous, being elected to that. Native American women are a group that are very powerless in American society, perhaps the most so, among the most so. So to have not one, but two of them from very different districts and even generations represented in Congress was very meaningful to that community, even though that didn't get anywhere near the play as some of the other women. But then you see that playing out writ large with Deb Haaland, who was basically an unknown, kind of more minor political player from New Mexico, now being the first Native American woman, Native American period, to be named cabinet secretary, to be named Secretary of Interior, which obviously has all kinds of implications for Joe Biden doing that. A little bit of a pain for Nancy Pelosi, as we talked about before, because that's losing a member, it's losing a vote. But again, a powerful position and a powerful message plucked from that class of the firsts.
Yeah, there's a section where you recount very movingly about how Sharice Davids spends time meeting with a bunch of teenage girls, asking them about career aspirations and speaking to them. And these are people who, there's no benefit for her because they can't vote for her. And yet she felt it was extremely important to do that. And you wondered, is this something the men do? That, this just seemed something that this class in particular was focused on.
I think so. I mean, Sharice Davids is an interesting character. Again, one of the two Native American women. She's from Kansas City, Kansas. She also beat the Republican incumbent, and she won pretty easily a re-election this year. Kind of keeps her head down, doesn't make a lot of news. That's probably people might have heard of her. She's a very unassuming, very self-effacing, very kind of, I would say this down-to-earth person. She's sort of the same no matter who she's around. Washington, Kansas, donors, wealthy women. I've seen her at, clubs for them. And the incident you described, which was at an after-school club for young girls in a housing project where the median income of family income is about $15,000 a year. So these are really low income girls who, as you point out, are not old enough to vote for her. And certainly their families are not donors. This is a truly selfless act, but she didn't go about it in the, like, look at me, I'm being so selfless. Look at how I'm here, which
the impression.
Yeah. A lot of politicians do that. They want to say, oh, look what I'm doing. Not at all. I was the only reporter there, and the only reason I was there was the service to my book, obviously. And she spent a long time with them and gave them a lot of time. And I think that, of course, men will go to 4-H clubs and visit high schools. I've seen that over the years. This is a little different, as you kind of allude to, because I think that with all of these women, and Sharice Davids really exemplified it in that moment, but I've seen it many, many times with all of these women, being very intentional about those type of things, because they understand that it's not kind of a Hallmark card message. It's really, really true that when women, young women and girls look out onto the floor of the House and see women, and especially women who might look like them, who come from communities that don't necessarily have a strong representation in government, it really does seed in them a sense of the possible, and makes them understand that they can run for office and have political power. That's not just a fuzzy message. It really is manifest. There's research that shows that. It's called descriptive representation. That's the political science term for it, when you represent a group. And that can mean a lot of different things. It can even mean, dentists, if you can be representing dentists, but it usually tends to refer to racial and ethnic identities. And descriptive representation's value often is in showing other people from that group that they can win office.
Okay. Great. Is there anything that you would like to say before I get into questions from our audience?
One thing that came up a lot earlier in this year, right after Elizabeth Warren lost, was defeated in the Democratic primaries, there was this sense that women have, hit this glass ceiling and they'll never be able to win higher office. Later, as we saw, obviously, Joe Biden chose Kamala Harris for his vice president. She will be the first woman and the first wear many coats of first as she enters that role January 20th. So obviously, I don't believe that women have hit that ceiling, even though I have to acknowledge that it's ridiculous that we have so few women still in Congress, and that have not, a country of our status, never having had a woman in the top job. But it's also, I always do like to point out that while women do have a harder time getting through primaries, particularly Republican women, they statistically win general elections at the same rate as men. So it's certainly not true that women can't win election. Now, Republican women have had a hard time over the last decade, and even as Democratic women pushed the majority to nearly 25% in 2018, making it the largest class of women in history, Republican women still lost ground, and they were really conscious of that and upset by that, and they studied those women, and they really tried to learn from them, and they ran in very large numbers in 2020 and gained a lot more momentum. Even Republican women have come back. 2 years ago, when Democrats did so well, Republican women dropped from 23 to 13. That was the lowest number since 1993. And this time around, they picked up a whole bunch of seats. They went from 13 to 28, and really helped Republicans, gain some ground. Out of the 13 seats that Republicans won back from Democrats, women won 11 of them. So they really were conscious about trying to increase their numbers that way. And because of Republican women, there are some more firsts, including the first two Korean American women from California. So that's been interesting to watch that. And I would just keep an eye on that, because the fact of the matter is, you can't have a majority. You can't have a great number of women, an important and significant number of women in Congress without having them from both parties. So I do think the future for elected women is bright. And I always tell women in the audience, for themselves, certainly for their daughters and their granddaughters, run for something. It doesn't have to be Congress. That's great if it's Congress. You can, running for Congress, it helps a lot if you have already been elected to something. The research shows that just positively, people vote for people who are already in the state legislature, on the school board, whatever your local leadership slate is like. It's just good to run for something. And I hope women and men encourage and support women in that endeavor.
Perfect. Okay, we have some questions. Let's get to it. Hang on. Why aren't they coming up? Okay. Here they are. Can you still hear me?
I see questions in the chat. Are those the ones you're looking for?
Yes. Okay, so Kay would like to know, to what do you attribute a small number of female Democratic representatives being elected in 2020 than in the previous election?
Well, that I kind of just answered, in the sense that people who got defeated were not all women, but and most of the women, I think, who got defeated, I think almost all of them were replaced by Republican women. So, but I think a big number of the Democrats who lost were women, and there wasn't much pickup. Democrats didn't defeat many Republicans in 2020. So there wasn't a lot of pickup of any Democrats, period, and they lost a little bit of ground.
Okay. Rich comments. I've met Speaker Pelosi. I found her to be personally charismatic. I think that quality is overlooked. Please comment.
And it's overlooked because that is really how you win friends and influence people, by being charismatic. And I think that that's kind of the funny thing about politics and all people in public life, is they have this public persona, or people have their own image or bring their own baggage to what they think about that person. And then when they meet them, they're really kind of wowed by them.
Jane asks, is Nancy Pelosi going to be able to give progressives some of what they want without them taking over the Democratic Party?
I think she does try to do that. She did that when she started the climate committee, if you will, although they didn't really do very much. And AOC, in fact, refused to be on it because it didn't have voting authorities, which, by the way, that year in 2019 rather, the speaker thought that was a real slap in her face, that she had pushed for that committee and then refused to serve on it. And I think that, I would pause that question for a second too, though, to sort of examine and let people examine for themselves what it really means to be progressive. Because a lot of things now that we think of as moderate positions, like the public option for health insurance, for example, were considered pretty radical progressive positions 10 years ago. And now Medicare for All has replaced that as the most progressive position. So a lot of things that the House has attempted to do on climate, even though it's certainly not the new Green Deal, are far to the left of anything that they've done since they got egg on their face with cap and trade over 10 years ago. So a lot of times what has been defined over time through changes in public opinion and through changes in the complexion of both parties as something that is considered pretty moderate now was in fact progressive before. So some of the things that she's promulgating that don't seem progressive are in fact very much so, and that would include President-elect Biden and his positions as well on a lot of these things. In terms of Medicare for All and some of the bigger issues, I think that she will avoid taking any positions that are considered to be, in this particular moment, fringe left or most progressive left, because they're not going to be the votes for that anyway in her caucus, and she doesn't, want to do that. But she does give them positions in certain places, give them gavels of subcommittees and so forth. Tries to reward people in different ways who work, particularly as team players, to push forward and propel the broader caucus agenda.
Okay. Do you think the effect of the pandemic in relation to medical cost is going to enhance the conversation about Medicare for All?
That's a really great question. I do think that we're in a fog of the pandemic right now because it's so protracted, and we've made, in so ways, so little progress in defeating the disease. And you still have so many people who are dying and in long-term and extremely expensive hospital situations. And because the other part of our brain is focused on the vaccine rollout. But I think when the dust is cleared, and it's already, I'm sure, happening now, where these medical bills, for long-term ventilation, all these just enormous emergency room bills, everyone knows what that's like. You go to the emergency room with a kidney stone, and you can be paying for that for a year. So you can imagine what these long-term hospital stays for critical care are going to be like. I think the fallout for that is something that we're not even pondering right now, but it's going to be enormous and long-lasting and extremely impactful. And sometimes, as you're kind of pointing out, it's situations that naturally push the conversation or push the reality because of the emergency nature of it. I don't know if that would that would pertain to Medicare for all, for example. But if you look at the stimulus bills that have come out, that of the CARES Act, for example, that was passed early on in the pandemic, the amounts of money that were spent on that were beyond what you could imagine any Republican ever voting for in any administration, ever, dwarfed all kinds of other, high ticket bills that they balked at years before. But it was just the sheer gravity of the situation. So sometimes events do, you're right, push short-term or long-term legislative fixes because it's literally an emergency.
Yeah. Davida asks, when a film is made about Nancy Pelosi, which actor will portray her?
Oh, well, I guess it depends on what era. It could be like The Crown, right? Where you have, let's just say The Crown, every person who played Queen Elizabeth. Every.
Jennifer says she would love to hear about Katie Porter, other than her whiteboards.
Right. Well, Katie Porter, we talked about her a little bit. She, like I said, was a law professor who had studied under Elizabeth Warren, single mom of 3. It's very difficult to be from Southern California, and she's from Orange County. She isn't even from LA, so that's like a really long trip every week or so to be making across 3 time zones. She actually did not talk about this in the campaign. It was revealed, and then she talked about it, but she didn't by any means illuminate it herself. Had been in a situation with her ex-husband, a domestic violence situation, in which her children at one point were actually threatened, her custody of the children. When that was revealed, she talked openly about that, and she has worked on legislation that pertains to that and really brings her lived experience, if you will, to those issues. And being a single mom and being someone who travels a lot for work and all of that, she wears pretty openly. She doesn't hide the fact that she has her blazer that she might put on for CNN in the back of her minivan that she throws on in between, pickups to soccer games and talking on the phone to her staff while she's at the grocery store and things like that. She in some ways has this every working woman's life, and it's not a put on. That's where she's at. And I will say, Katie Porter to me was very interesting to follow around because she's a bit mercurial, and I've seen her that way with staff too. She can be really fun and sweet, and she can turn on a dime and be really short-tempered and snappish. And I think that that's her personality. She's that way, but I also think that it reflects the enormous difficulty of the geographic pressures on her as a member who became pretty high profile. And believe me, she likes the limelight. I'm sure she would have been very interested in Kamala Harris's Senate seat, for example. There's a lot of people, a lot of high profile Democrats from California who are wanting that. But she definitely, I think, was pretty open about her interest in that. So very ambitious. She's absolutely phenomenal at raising money. She's always one of the highest earners in campaign finance season. Very aggressive. She's really good at following up with constituents. She stays on top of folks. She understands that she has a lot of Republicans in her district, and so she kind of, even though I would, think she's actually pretty progressive for the area that she's in, but she seems to be really popular with her voters, and she's really made that work.
Okay. Are the women you discuss able to be appointed to important committees, or do they wind up where they won't or they don't want to be because it's trouble?
No, yeah, it's not that so much. I mean, again, AOC wanted an energy and commerce, which is arguably one of the most important committees, but it takes people 10 years to get on some of those committees, even longer. I mean, there are just some coveted committees, but there are certain women, and you usually serve on about 2 or 3 committees, 3 committees usually. One of them is definitely not going to be your favorite, although you can certainly, what's happened with this freshman class last year, now they're sophomores, was pretty amazing that a lot of them were chairing subcommittees, which the subcommittees within the committees, which was really kind of unheard of. Even the Watergate babies, who were the most analogous class coming out of a tumultuous period, a controversial president, obviously, a large number of them, young, of course, mostly men. were not chairing subcommittees. So that's quite remarkable that they've been given that power. But yeah, they're on important committees. I mean, a lot of these women I told you from the national security space are on the House Armed Services Committee. Very important. They're impactful there. The Oversight Committee is where you're bringing in witnesses, and we saw some of the very high profile, obviously people related to the impeachment hearings and things like that. You saw that's a very powerful, high profile committee, lots of big witnesses coming through there. So, and you make the best of the committee you're on with the witnesses that you have, and you can get real attention for yourself in terms of how you question people. So I would say that by and large, the women have been pretty happy with the committees that they've been assigned to, because look, that class is very big. So by dint of being large, you're going to be a big percentage of the overall Democratic caucus. You're going to get some pretty good spots.
Okay. Jennifer asks, what is the relationship between long-term legislators like Jan Schakowsky, who represents this part of Evanston, and these new members? Are the experienced, accepting, mentoring? Can you elaborate?
I think it was a mixed bag, as all things are. I do think I saw her with some members early on. Debbie Dingell had 3 freshmen from Michigan. And Debbie Dingell, at this point, with the elimination of some families from Congress and some long-serving members who lost primaries that I mentioned earlier, the Dingell families, I think the kind of reigning longest-serving family in the House now. And Debbie Dingell from Michigan, definitely has played a mentor to the 3 freshmen from her state. And they were very supportive to her when her husband died, and spent a lot of time kind of rallying around her. So that was a tight personal relationship. Lydia Vasquez from New York, I think, tried to quietly mentor AOC. I think a lot of these women do try to do that. And some of them, I'm not going to lie, though, I think I did hear in my reporting period that some of them were annoyed by the attention that they got, some of their sense of entitlement, kind of per what we were discussing earlier on committees that they wanted early on. So I think it was a mixed bag, but I think by and large, the women were excited not only to have all these bright, interesting, new, largely millennial women among them, diverse, ethnically, racially, professionally, geographically, but that, very happy that in the 100th anniversary of their women's right to vote, that they had given them the largest number of women in Congress. So I think it was a pretty, by and large, pretty happy-go-lucky situation among the women that became marred, as we said before, by policy differences and political differences. And that was more of a left-centrist divide, if you will, than it was older versus newer.
Okay. Shirley asks, which funding groups have helped Democratic and Republican women get elected to Congress?
Well, the biggest list for Democrats is obviously Emily's List. Emily's List has been around a long time. Its specific mandate is to help pro-choice Democrats get elected, so it doesn't exclusively support women, but it principally supports women. And it's just a fundraising powerhouse, and getting money from Emily's List is super helpful. And they often kind of help, grow candidates. And then Republican women, that has been one of the reasons that they've struggled, because they've had sort of a bunch of Winning for Women and different kinds of groups that are much smaller, much more disparate. And one thing I heard a lot when I was reporting on the book and working on my chapter on Republican women is there was a hope that they could kind of collapse some of these smaller groups into one larger, more powerful group like Emily's List that could be more impactful, both in terms of raising money, disseminating money, and just getting attention, I think, too.
Okay. Evan asks, do you think there was any real chance for any of the Democratic women candidates for president to get the nomination given Hillary Clinton's loss to Trump?
I do. I don't really connect the two. I think that Hillary Clinton's loss to Trump disappointed a lot of women. And again, they kind of used that to believe, especially after that, with the loss of all the women, in particular Elizabeth Warren in the 2020 primary, to be this notion that women can't win. And I always had to point out, like, Hillary Clinton is sort of her own person. It's sort of a sui generis situation. She was Hillary Clinton, and that hurt her more than being a woman. I'm not suggesting there wasn't misogyny in that campaign. Of course there was, but Hillary Clinton had her own problems with voters just by being Hillary Clinton. I think that women were hurt, as were all the people who did not ultimately prevail on that 2020 stage, just by the vastness of it. There were so many people, and there were a number of people kind of representing different factions of the party, if you will. Pete Buttigieg obviously had his moment in the sun and took a lot of spotlight away from people. And it was too broad in some ways. But at the same time, I don't know. I do think that there was this sense that what had to happen is they had to have a nominee who could beat Trump. That was the one. It was not a moment for symbolism. It was not a moment for even particular political ideology as per se. There were a lot of people who weren't that excited about Joe Biden, as you know, particularly young people. But the ultimate decision was who can beat Trump. That was the prevailing, overwhelming, singular obsession. And I don't think those particular women necessarily did anyone feel had the secret sauce to do that. And I think that was probably what worked against them more than this notion that, oh, we don't want a woman to be president.
Okay. Let's see. Do you think that the squad, the justice, badass groups will help Biden's administration with progressive issues, which tend to improve incrementally? Or do you think they'll hinder that due to dramatic extreme positions, abrasiveness, etc.?
I mean, look, the most important thing that's going to drive Joe Biden's agenda, one, who's controlling the Senate, which, as we talked about earlier, depends on what happens. It won't be decided today. We won't know today, obviously, but what happens in Georgia, the election that's being held there, the runoff today. Once we know that, two, let's assume we continue with a divided government. Will Republicans in the Senate work with Biden? They won't even, you have a sizable number of them who won't even certify his election. So the tea leaves don't look great for that, right? House Democrats, the House minority party, unlike in the Senate, is really marginalized. So they can cause problems. And Nancy Pelosi does have a very narrow majority. So it's going to be, behoove Democrats. They will be beholden to each other to stick together. Because if you have a lot of defections to stay popular back home on something, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, it's going to be really hard to promulgate his agenda if Democrats are defecting from it left and right to save themselves, and for their any perceived weaknesses back home of being so-called too progressive. But I'm not so sure that, Biden is going to pursue a so-called very progressive agenda. I think, look, Joe Biden's biggest agenda right now is to dial back the disaster, the specific disaster of the pandemic, then its aftermath, what we anticipate may be very long-term problems for broad sectors of the economy, the healthcare costs that we've discussed, and all the impacts that's made, the student debt crisis that still looms, and how they can deal with that. He's a crisis era, disaster era president, to say nothing of the very real and sizable shredding of our international reputation and democratic norms that have been pretty shattering to what everyone sort of takes for granted as the so-called American exceptionalism, which has been very, very called into question, and it's going to have to be addressed in some way to have a functioning democracy where you have what we still have is a two-party system that can actually work. So in terms of some kind of, Obama-esque broad-based legislative agenda, progressive legislative agenda, or any broad-based agenda that's all about sort of changing prescriptive public policy in a great way, I just don't see that right out of the gate. Again, it's really about managing the crisis that's before him.
Yeah.
Democrats will have to stick together for that. If Democrats start fraying and infighting in the House, and to some degree in the Senate, where they have even less control, it's going to be really roiling waters for him and for Pelosi.
It's interesting. You talk about how Biden's going to be navigating. And he has relationships from all of his work in government service. And yet, like his relationship with Lindsey Graham is a non-starter right now. Supposedly has a good relationship with Mitch McConnell, but how is that going to translate into getting his cabinet approved and getting things, up for votes? I don't know. Do you?
Not necessarily well. I think the Biden administration is going to make a big mistake. They've brought back a lot of old time Obama people, and they're trying to, appoint a lot of people from that administration, people who are seen as extremely competent stewards of government. And that's understandable because that was one of besides the allegations of obvious corruption and worse in Trump administration, was a lack of competency. And so that's what they're going to try to be correcting right out of the gate. Having said that, they are going to make a big mistake if they think that the 2010, 2012, 2014, playbooks on the Hill are going to serve them. They're not. It's a different Congress now. What began as a Tea Party movement, which was challenging for Republican leadership and of course Democrats, has morphed into Trumpism. That is the defining characteristic of the contemporary Republican Party, especially, as elected officials go and the base voters go. It's not the majority of the country, obviously, but it's the majority of their party. And as we're watching the events play out on Capitol Hill this week, that reflects that. That is a very large percentage of the Republican caucus that are not conference that he doesn't know personally, has no relationships with, doesn't understand necessarily. It's not clear how much people around him understand these folks. They are in refusing to certify the election. The ones who are doing that in open, blatant defiance of Mitch McConnell, which is something that also doesn't happen that often. He has really quite good control of his conference, and people tend to take his leadership, and he's led them to many victories. So he's always been a trusted steward, and this is one of the rare times where there's a number of them, particularly newer members and brand new members, completely defying Mitch McConnell. So even if his relationship could be something other than nakedly partisan with Biden, which I'm not even sure about in this day and age, but even if it could be, that would be very much befelled by these new members. And this is the same thing that John Boehner ran into again after the Tea Party wave that brought his party into power and made him speaker in 2011. Ultimately, those exact same people, when there were enough of them, came to eat him, and he was destroyed by it. So that is the dynamic that's happening on the Hill right now. And if the Biden administration thinks this is going to be, bipartisan deal making, at the long end of the day, they're going to have to think a lot harder about that, because most of these folks are thinking themselves in relationship to Trump voters, and Trumpism.
Kind of a sad commentary. An anonymous questioner asks, do you feel that there's anti-Semitism within the squad?
Definitely, there were accusations specifically lodged at Ilhan Omar of anti-Semitism. And interestingly, not very often was that particular accusation made against Rashida Tlaib, again, who's from Michigan. Their stories are different. The way they talk about the language that they use is different. I think the relationships that they have with Jewish members, by and large, has been different. And what happened with Ilhan Omar, where she got into a lot of hot water, was she was using a lot of language and tropes that people identified with anti-Semitism that she and her staff said at the time stemmed more from her ignorance of the language and ignorance of the culture, having grown up in a Somali immigrant community, where frankly, that in Somalia, I've talked to my colleagues who have been foreign correspondents there. There is a fair amount of anti-Semitism in that country, but it's more almost kind of culturally ingrained than it is based on any particular conflicts, the way you see in the Middle East, for example, as it pertains to the Israel-Palestine conflict, for example. It's a little different. Having said that, she ran into these incidents enough times, self-owns, if you will, that she definitely alienated a lot of her Jewish colleagues and Jewish voters in her own district. Not that she didn't win quite easily there, she did. But I think that that is always going to dog her with Jewish voters.
Has she expanded her worldview?
Well, I don't know about expanded her worldview from her point of view, because her point of view is that she was never anti-Semitic and she didn't understand that when she used that kind of language, that's how it was going to be perceived. And she was, using, she didn't mean it in that way. So she seemed genuinely baffled by these accusations. She has a lot of Jewish staff. I think that they worked hard with her to make her understand what those words meant in the Jewish community, but I just don't know. It's not. And I saw a lot of progressive Jewish groups at her events, especially like Muslim Jewish types of events. It's not as if she has no support from any Jewish person who exists. But I think with the broad mainstream American Jewish coalition, as such as it was, and I don't even mean to say it that way, because actually the Jewish Americans are a very, as you know, generationally, culturally, politically diverse group. And each one from each individual group, they're pretty outspoken. And younger Jews obviously have very different views than older Jews on a lot of issues, are more empathic toward her, if you will, toward the Palestinian causes, all kinds of things. So it's not a monolithic vote or community, but definitely among many of the mainstream voters, Jewish voters, for lack of better terminology, I would say she will always be viewed with suspicion, is my guess.
Okay. Joyce asks, what are the issues around which there is the most likelihood of bipartisan action? Climate change, infrastructure, Social Security and Medicare, housing, anything else?
Infrastructure is a good one to name. In the very beginning of the Trump administration, I wrote a story which I later came to regret, saying that I thought that Trump could do an infrastructure deal with Democrats. I think they thought that in the first 30 days. It quickly became clear that Democrats were never going to be able to work with Donald Trump, but that was later. In the beginning, that was something he said he wanted to do, and they wanted to do it too, because it was this nice intersection of a populist and progressive agenda, just spending a lot of money and potentially jobs program on infrastructure. So I think that could definitely be a good place to start, especially again in the post-pandemic world, if that's viewed as as a way to employ people.
Okay. We're pretty much finished. Is there anything that you would like to say before we kind of wrap up?
I think just again, thanking your audience. So many of you coming out in the middle of the day. It's wonderful I wish I could see you all personally. It's what's nice about Zoom events is you can get lots of people there that might otherwise fit in a room. But what's sad is that I can't see your faces and interact with you personally and sign your books. I hope you do buy books. My book, other people's books, support your local bookseller, I think, who's affiliated with this event, I believe.
Yes, that we support Bookends and Beginnings and Book Evanston.
So yes, that's great. Please support both of those bookstores. I would love you to buy my book, The Firsts, buy my cookbooks, buy other people's books. So many great books came out. I've been in an author support group for pandemic era authors, and I can't tell you the many great novels and books of poetry and some nonfiction works that I've read. So, and cookbooks, lots of cookbooks I bought this year. So I hope everybody buys books, support your local bookstore, and just, thank you so much for coming out and having this discussion with me today.
Jennifer, for those in the audience who may not be aware, Jennifer has written 2 cookbooks, one with Frank Bruni, her colleague at the New York Times, on meatloaf, and another book that she authored herself, a collection of junk food recipes, how to make junk food at home. Is that?
Both good pandemic topics, by the way. So pick them up, there's all kinds of beautiful cookbooks that came out this year. So I encourage everyone to support your local bookstore and pick those up, and stay in the kitchen if you can. I know it becomes tiresome to do it, but just curl up with a novel and order takeout too. That's good.
Thank you so much. This was really, really fascinating. It was so good to talk to you, and thank you for all your hard work and for covering these important stories. I will look forward to reading what you have to say about what's taking place.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for your time, everybody.
Thank you so much. Everyone, thank you, Abigail Evanston. Next week, we have Michelle Nichols coming back from the Adler Planetarium to talk to us about research and the explorer that hopefully will land on Mars. It'll be a great discussion. Thank you again, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.